weekend at the new club. Every weekend is dressed down, so I've missed an opportunity to wear my torn jeans and bomber jacket. I might take this jacket off at somewhere halfway through as a sort of gesture in that direction. Anyway, prior to this event, David and I have had a few words about a division of labour, and the resulting idea is to offer a kind of three-part introduction, starting with myself looking mainly at the novel from the outside up to the completion of the first edition, with David then turning more directly to that first edition text, finishing with its transformation as part of the magnum opus collector edition, and this being concluded by a short overview of the novel's afterlife, chiefly as drama and film. For my own part, I come to this event having just reread Rob Roy in David's excellent first edition based Edinburgh edition 2008. I did have a copy.
I have it here.
Louise, I've jumped the gun and you haven't introduced us. I'm very sorry. Yes. Turning, as I read, I turned from the main text to the explanatory notes there and occasionally to the glossary while proceeding. And to tell the truth, it's an admission of sorts, this represents the first time that I've engaged with an EEWN volume in a generally readerly sort of way. That is, I've always had a professional academic sort of interest beforehand. One thing that struck me in the process of reading was how often the narrative points to an admixture of selfish and social motives in the characters. Take, for example, the young hero Frank Osbaldeston on his concern to retrieve information from the captured Rob Roy. I should do myself injustice did I not add that my views were not merely selfish. I was too much interested in my singular acquaintance not to be desirous of rendering him such services as his unfortunate situation might demand or admit of receiving. The question I would now like to put is whether this might, in some ways, also reflect Scott's own situation as a novelist at this point. With this in view, I'd like to look at two elements in the preliminaries to the first edition, which might be said to reflect these dual impulses or tendencies. To begin with, let's look at the very start of the first edition with the motto on the title page. For why? Because the good old rule sufficeth them, the simple plan that they who take, who have the power, and they should keep who can. This comes from a longer poem by William Wordsworth written in 1807 that is called Rob Roy's Grave, the poem, and is meant to show the stark survivalist outlook of an outcast. Exactly the same extract had featured earlier in an advance notice for the novel in the Edinburgh Evening Courant on the 19th of May 1817. It also appears in an undated letter from Scott to John Ballantyne, acting as Scott's literary agent, in which Scott asked Ballantyne to copy over the motto for the newspaper and announces that the first two chapters go to James, that is John's brother, the printer. J.C. Corson dates this letter early June 1817, but most probably it came earlier in the wake of a crucial meeting involving Scott, John Ballantyne and the publisher Archibald Constable on the 5th of May to decide terms for the new novel, and at which meeting, according to J.G. Lockhart's Life of Scott, Constable was allowed to provide the title. Granted that Lockhart's account is accurate, Constable was very likely being offered a sop to ease what is in other respects a highly advantageous deal for Scott and his associates. The main terms of the deal were written down by John as a memorandum for Constable's firm on the same day. As literary agent for the author of Waverley, I have to offer you on his part a new work in 3 volumes to be published in September and to be entitled Rob Roy on the following conditions. You shall print 6,000 or 10,000 copies as you find advisable, admitting to 1/3 thereof Messrs. Longman and Co., to another John Ballantyne, and on their coming under each 1/3 the total engagements. You shall accept £400 at 4 months presently to account of author's profits. Longman and Co. also accepting the same sum, and John Ballantyne paying £400, being in all £1,200 to account of author's profits. You shall accept at a year's date £200 for a third share of £600 of the stock of the late firm of John Ballantyne and Co., the other two parties accepting on the same terms the value of the stock prorated in the same manner as in the cases of Guy Mannering and the Antiquary. A number of salient points are worth quickly noting here. Firstly, the numbers for the first print run of a novel were exceptional for that time. Much the same can be said about the sums being generated in the form of advances, here amounting to £1,200 from the three interested parties, or £1,800 if the purchase of John Ballantyne's old book stock, more on that later, is added, in present terms amounting to about £160,000. Lastly, a new ingredient in the arrangement is the inclusion of John Ballantyne as a nominal holder of a 1/3 interest, along with Constable and the London firm of Longmans, though in the expectation that Ballantyne would immediately bargain with Constable to sell his share, allowing Constable the management and the lion's share of the impression, as well as generating further profit for Scott and a nice slice of commission for himself. To return to that Wordsworth motto, most obviously this relates to Rob Roy himself, a figure already well known in legend and drama. At the same time, the Darwinian ethics attributed to him in the Wordsworth passage are not paralleled by Scott's novel, where the character, if anything, falls on the more favourable side of the selfish social divide. Considering the exuberant post-contracting moment when the motto was decided on, might it not equally apply to Scott's triumph in another Darwinian situation, that of bookselling? It would be hard to think of a more credit-based capitalist practice than bookselling in Scott's time. Equipped with a lawyer's training, Scott had mostly done well out of this, opting generally for large sums for copyright in the case of his major poems. When moving towards fiction, however, he was in an unusually impecunious situation, mainly as a result of the failure of John Ballantyne and Co., the publishing firm he had set up and secretly co-owned. It was against a backdrop of near bankruptcy that Waverley 1814 was bargained for, though Scott was astute enough to decline Constable's offer of a sum for outright copyright, insisting instead on receiving half profits, a system whereby profits calculated on the wholesale price minus production costs were shared between author and publisher. For this to work in Scott's best interest, two other ingredients were essential. Firstly, Scott was careful to contract for a specific number of copies or editions, allowing him to negotiate freshly for subsequent editions and if need be, with a different publisher. Secondly, he was always insistent on receiving advance payments in anticipation of profits in the form of accepted bills with a promise to pay after a certain length of time. In practice, this meant that Scott, through an intermediary, usually John Ballantyne, could go to the bank to have acceptances discounted for cash, for immediate cash, i.e. the banker would keep a percentage to compensate for the weight and risk until able to receive the full amount from the holder of the bill, or the acceptor of the bill. The system only worked fully, however, if the original bill was considered sound. If not, the banker might charge a larger discount, or failing that, the bill might not be transferable at all, creating a crisis of confidence and the possible collapse of the issuing concern, as happened in 1825 and 26, or more immediately think of the recent banking crisis. Scott's shifting between publishers prior to Rob Roy had largely been determined by two considerations: a desire to maximise sales and the need to secure creditworthy bills. In fact, it was news of a collapse in subsequent sales of Tales of My Landlord, 1816, published by the rival Edinburgh-London combination of Blackwood and Murray, which triggered his return to Constable with Rob Roy. Scott once more was under financial pressure, having embarked on building extensions at Abbotsford, intent too on redeeming a bond of £4,000 for which the Duke of Buccleuch was guarantor. To expedite the latter, he also entered into a bargain with Constable for a new series of Tales of My Landlord, well before Rob was finished. Compounding difficulties, Scott became seriously ill in the autumn with stomach cramps, driving Constable's partner Robert Cadell to distraction, desperate as he was to get the work out within the year. It just managed to squeeze in, though the imprint date is 1818. At no point, arguably, in Scott's career were the profits from publishing, were the profits and risks so exaggerated. In one sanguine moment in October, Scott calculated profits from his publishing ventures of £13,800, more than £1 million in today's terms. Behind the paper confidence, however, there are a number of disturbing cracks. What if the novel, as Cadell feared, failed to match the success of its predecessors? What if Longmans refused to accept John Ballantyne's stock on the offered terms, as they actually did with the second Tales? And lastly, would the stability looked for through the transfer of profits into land with Abbotsford actually work out? Much of this, I would like to suggest, is reflected in the novel itself. Not up front, but rather in the recesses of the plot. A number of commercial concerns are involved. In London there is Osbaldeston and Tresham, in which the chief clerk is Owen, a name reminiscent of Owen Rees, the partner in Longman & Co. in Scott's day, who handled the firm's Scottish interests. Then there's the Glasgow firm of Macfitty, Macfin & Co., hitherto the main handlers of Osbaldeston business in Scotland, who prove treacherous. In contrast stands the naturally selfish but trustworthy Bailey Nicol Jarvie, who shares an element of rotundity with Archibald Constable, who says and may represent some kind of facetious compliment from author to publisher. It's Jarvie who at one point offers the fullest explanation of the underhand dealings which threaten the collapse of the House of Osbaldeston and the interconnection with Jacobite rebellion. As David explains exhaustively in his notes, Osbaldeston Senior has bought and other goods from Highland chiefs and paid them with promissory notes dated to fall due on the 12th of September 1715. The payees, i.e. the chiefs, on receipt had presented these bills to London bankers and merchants and received ready money at a discount. The villain Rashleigh has subsequently gone to Scotland with assets supposedly to pay off the bills held by the bankers, but has disappeared, threatening the collapse of Osbaldeston credit as the bills prove worthless. Taking this one step further, the suggestion is that the Glasgow bankers will then seek repayment from the chiefs to whom they have advanced money, who, in their impoverished state, will break out into open rebellion as the better option. Though the last point seems a bit stretched, this does point to an overall instability underlying the novel, notwithstanding counter-assertions from both Osbaldeston Senior and Jarvie regarding the liberalising effects of commercial endeavour. Nor does there seem to be any steadying of the situation when, near the conclusion, Frank's father, mirroring Scott, decides, and I quote, to convert a great share of the large profits which had accrued from the rapid rise of the funds upon the suppression of the rebellion into land, in the form of supporting his son's inheritance of Osbaldeston Hall. On the contrary, Frank, on taking up possession, seems as lonely and as vulnerable as anywhere else in the novel. For the other dimension in the novel, let's turn again to its preliminaries, this time to the introductory advertisement in which Scott attempts to explain his decision to return to the genre after supposedly making his farewell at the end of the Antiquary. Having suggested that consistency cannot be expected from a phantom, he goes on to propose that A better apology may be found in imitating the confession of honest Benedict, that when he said he would die a bachelor, he did not think he should live to see himself married. Notwithstanding a tendency since the Magnum to think of the Waverley novels as a homogeneous body, one should not underestimate the relatively piecemeal and stop-and-start nature of Scott's early output. Even when launching Guy Mannering, Scott was testing out the market with another long poem in the form of The Lord of the Isles, 1815. If there was a main turning point for the author of Waverley, in the sense of a no going back, then I think it can legitimately be claimed as Rob Roy. And as the analogy with Benedict in Much Ado About Nothing might suggest, this came about at least partly as the result of a love affair, Scott himself having become wedded to a medium in which he found incalculable new freedoms. As such, as much as any of the Waverley novels, Rob Roy offers a homage to the traditions of the novel, echoing, among other things, the first-person narratives of Defoe, the broad social caricatures of Fielding, Smollett's comic savagery, albeit softened here, and the displaced and mystified central figures of Anne Radcliffe's Gothic fictions. One difference compared with Scott's predecessors and other contemporary novelists might nevertheless be said to lie in the firmness and authority with which he maintains a 2 or even 3-dimensional historical narrative, taking in the mature Frank's vantage point circa 1763, the main events of the story prior to the 1715 Rising, while encompassing the underlying political context from 1688. It was such characteristics which led reviewers at the time to declare Scott the inventor of a freshly, fully fledged historical romance. Even more so, I think, he can be considered now as the creator of a new species of social novel. Rob Roy in particular is filled with a hectic assortment of social types, all to a degree governed by selfish instincts, though through interaction capable of producing a wider interdependent community. Nicole Jarvie and Rob Roy, partly through kinship, though one also senses a wider sympathy, managed to communicate over the divide between primitive and commercial societies. Political difference also fails to inhibit Diana and Sir Frederick Vernon's willingness to relieve Frank from the difficulties caused by Rashleigh's absconding, though in practical terms this would seem to lessen their hopes for a successful rising. Much of this might be said to reflect the moral sentimentalism of the Scottish Enlightenment, but this, if so, it's undoubtedly given an extra life and buoyancy by Scott's fiction, as the isolated man of feeling of the 18th century novel becomes reshaped as a communally active man of sentiment inhabiting a world where the whole can be considerably greater than the parts. This, as much as anything, I would suggest, helps explain the immediate and unprecedented success of this novel, though Cadell, reading it in proof, had earlier expressed doubts. A bad, bitter story. The general expectation is that Rob will be the most unbending villain, thief, robber, rascal, but good in him for all that. In the novel, he has some of these traits, but figures far less on the stage than the title leads the reader to expect. Indeed, he appears scarcely in any shape till towards the end of the second volume. Regardless of this, the uptake in Scotland was rapid and early opinions good. The book is better liked by many judges than I had anticipated. Rob Roy moves off amazingly. The great drain is to Glasgow. As early as the 21st of January, a fourth edition of 3000 was commissioned to meet demand. To achieve such staggering sales over such a short period, a deeper than ever saturation of the fiction market must have taken place, and on a number of levels, in terms of geography, gender, and class. An idea of the scale of this and the sense of unification that went with it can be gathered from Thomas Love Peacock's essay on fashionable literature, written that same year. On the arrival of Rob Roy, the scholar lays aside his Plato, the statesman suspends his calculations, the young lady deserts her harp, the critic smiles as he trims his lamp, the lounger thanks God for his good fortune, and the weary artisan resigns his sleep for the refreshment of the magic page. Regarded as many as the definitive Scott title, Rob Roy continued at the forefront of sales, in the Victorian era constituting the largest impression in the sixpenny edition bought out by A&C Black, 137,000 copies, followed by 131,000 for Waverley. But this is to jump the gun rather, so perhaps after a brief introduction we can move over to David to cover the first edition text more broadly and its interface with the Magnum Opus edition. I've sort of introduced you, David, and I feel terribly guilty because the excitement of starting and the cameras going on, I forgot. I had asked Louise to introduce us, and I behaved shamefully, I'm afraid. Would you like, since I'm known to people in the Scott Club, would you like to say a few brief words before David pops out?
I just carry on.
You just carry on. Okay, shamefaced was the word.
Well, what Peter has done, in a sense, is to say what is the underlying stuff of Rob Roy, and it's Scott himself. Here Scott is a writer, a literary adventurer in a capitalist world, intent on making money, but also opening himself up to huge risks. I'm taking up precisely where Peter left off. Cadell was right. There isn't much of Rob Roy in the Rob Roy. Scott did not write up to the name, so what is it really about? So I'm dealing with the obvious stuff, not the underlying stuff. It's normally described as a Jacobite novel. One of the series, which begins with the tale of old mortality, goes on to the Black Dwarf, Rob Roy, Waverley, the Highland Widow, and Red Gauntlet. A series which deals with the religious and dynastic struggle for Britain from 1679 to 1765. Viewed in this way, Rob Roy is Scott's study of the 1715 Rising. But unlike Waverley, he does not deal with the military campaign at all, but analyses the underlying economic and social causes. In Osbaldistone Hall, Scott depicts an utterly unproductive economy and what it does to the people. Diana Vernon tells Frank that his cousins form a happy compound of sot, gamekeeper, bully, horse jockey and fool. Bailey Nicol Jarvie provides a brilliant analysis of Highland overpopulation and the lack of opportunity for productive endeavour, to which Frank is led to exclaim, "In the name of God, what do they do, Mr. Jarvie? It makes one shudder to think of their situation." I think it's wonderful, shuddering to think of the situation of the unemployed. To which Jarvie says, "There are hundreds and thousands, wi' gun and pistol, dirk and doorlach, ready to disturb the peace of the kintra whenever the laird likes, and that's the grievance of the Highlands, which are, and hae been for this 1,000 years bypast, a bike of the maist lawless and Christian limmers that ever disturbed a douce, quiet, God-fearing neighbourhood." He points out that in the 25 years since the Glorious Revolution, they have been kept quiet by subsidies. But as George I's government is about to withdraw them, Jarvie predicts a rising. "Weel, but there's a new world coming up with this King George. I say, God bless him for ain. There's neither like to be siller nor pensions ganging among them. They hanna the means of maintaining the clans that eat them up. And ye may guess from what I've said before, their credits, gain in the Lowlands, and a man that can whistle up 1,000 or 1,500 Lincoln lads to do his will would hardly get £50 in his band at the Cross of Glasgow. This canna stand lang. There will be an outbreak for the Stuarts. There will be an outbreak. The trigger for the rising was to be Rashleigh's financial plot, which specifically aimed to force Highland chiefs into rebellion by making them bankrupt. The strategy was to create a credit crisis which would bring down the British government. However, the state was financially too strong. The ability of the English government and from 1707 the British government to fight wars was based on their ability to finance them through borrowing. In the year ending in Michaelmas 1716, 29 September 1716, short-term government borrowing increased by £1.2 million, about 12.5% of overall government expenditure, to finance army expenditure, which itself increased from £924,000 in the year ending in 1715 to £2.151 million in 1716. The money was raised by subscription, i.e. by inviting known investors to lend. In the fiction, William Osbaldistone is one of these investors, and through him Scott exemplifies why the British state would predominate. Frank tells us that when they returned to London from Glasgow, we immediately associated with those bankers and eminent merchants who agreed to support the credit of the government, and to meet that run upon the funds on which the conspirators had greatly founded their hope of furthering their undertaking, by rendering the government, as it were, bankrupt. Rob Roy is a work of fiction, but it is also an important contribution to the historiography of the 15, and in its day it was a new and brilliant one. It's only in modern times that historians such as Bruce Lenman have got round to saying that the economic imbalance within Britain was the primary cause of the rising. Rob Roy is also the story of its hero and narrator, Francis Osbaldistone. Throughout his career, Scott experimented with forms of narration, and these experiments were part of his exploration of the philosophical problem, how does one know the past? In this case, the past is retrieved through memorializing and reconstruction. This is a first-person retrospective narrative. 2 points of time are represented in all retrospective first-person narrations: the time in which the narrative is set and the time of writing. In this case, one is 1715. Frank tells the story of a crucial year in history as he experienced it. It also happens to be the year in which he turns 21 and enters into manhood. The other, the time of writing, is Frank's 70th year. A footnote reads, "This seems to have been written about the time of Wilkes and Liberty." And John Wilkes was arrested for seditious libel in 1763. At the beginning of the novel, Frank talks rather stiffly about the time of writing. He says that in preparing these memoirs, he's not motivated by vanity and egotism. He's not like the Duc de Sully, a man who dictated the events of his life to secretaries, who wrote them up in the third person, and then read them back to the Duke so that he could admire his own achievements. It's wonderful, isn't it? He hopes that some moral benefit might be obtained from considering the follies and headstrong impetuosity of his youth. His overall mood is moral and depressive. Okay, he has lost his beloved wife, but depression is Frank's habitual outlook. It's clear from the way he thinks about his own past and the general past that he is depressed by it. For instance, before entering the Lake Kirk in Glasgow, he contemplates the tombs of the churchyard. The contents of these sad records of mortality, the vain sorrows which they record, the stern lesson which they teach of the nothingness of humanity, the extent of ground which they so closely cover, and their uniform and melancholy tenor, reminded me of the role of the prophet, which was written within and without, and there were written therein lamentations and mourning and woe. The words come from Ezekiel, and are apposite for the summation of the message that God requires Ezekiel to deliver to the children of Israel, whom he describes as a rebellious nation that have rebelled against me. They and their fathers have transgressed against me, even unto this very day, for they are impudent children and stiff-hearted. The words that came into Frank's head in the churchyard in Glasgow in 1715 were written down in his 70th year in 1763. Frank does not change. Rob Roy has been criticised because Frank does not seem to be wiser as he writes than he was in 1715. For instance, A.O.J. Cockshut and Edgar Johnson both comment that the act of writing does not seem to be either cathartic or therapeutic. Yes, Frank does not develop, but I don't think that this is an artistic failure. Scott is depicting a man who is suffering from a kind of moral melancholy. But the gloom is not just constitutional. It's a response to the world through which he has lived. As he writes, he recognises that part of his opposition to his father arose from a priggish distaste for generating the prosperity whose benefits he enjoyed. I only saw in my father's proposal for my engaging in business a desire that I should add to those heaps of wealth which he had himself acquired. And imagining myself the best judge of the path to my own happiness, I did not conceive that I should increase it by augmenting a fortune which I believed was already sufficient, and more than sufficient for every use, comfort, and elegant enjoyment. That is a double-schemed utterance. The immature young man of 1715 may have rebelled against his father's obsession with the making of money, but it was in 1763 that he wrote the phrase, "those heaps of wealth." The dunghill image suggests a continuing distaste for mercantile wealth. Why? There are two very moving statements by Diana Vernon and Rob Roy in which they present themselves as victims. What they say suggests that the mercantile expansionism of the business community had real costs and real pain. Di complains, "I belong to an oppressed sect and antiquated religion, and instead of getting credit for my devotion, as is due to all good girls, my kind friend Justice Inglewood may send me to the house of correction merely for worshipping God in the way of my ancestors, and say, as old Pembroke did to the Abbess of Wilton when he usurped her convent and establishment, 'Go spin, you jade, go spin.'" The penal laws as expounded in the novel by Jobson were haphazard and incoherent, passed at sundry times between Elizabeth's accession in 1557 and George I's death in 1727, and stayed there in force until the Catholic Relief Act of 1778, the Second Catholic Relief Act of 1791, and the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829. Broadly speaking, they were intended to prevent Catholics from practicing their religion, and those who did not attend the Church of England were subjected to various penalties, the worst of which was the land tax. Those who had not taken the oath of allegiance and supremacy had to pay double land tax. Northern Catholics like Sir Hildebrand had been impoverished by the law. The circumstances of Rob Roy are not the same. The MacGregors had been proscribed as a clan, but he himself was a respectable cattle dealer and landowner until he became bankrupt in 1712. In those days, people unable to pay their debts were proclaimed outlaws, and so on the 25th of September 1712, letters of caption were issued authorising Rob Roy's capture and imprisonment until such time as he had satisfied his creditors. He owed money to the Duke of Montrose, and for reasons that are not clear, Montrose took the lead in trying to capture him. From this period, Rob Roy considered himself to be a man unjustifiably persecuted by the Duke, and the legal processes by which debtors were criminalised turned Rob Roy into one of the Highland thieves whom Jarvie denounces. In the circumstances, it is no wonder that Rob Roy protests against being hunted like an otter, or a seal, or a salmon upon the shallows, and that by my very friends and neighbours. 3 pages later, he makes a more general protest about the treatment of the Highlanders. You must think hardly of us, Mr. Osbaldistone, and it is not natural that it should be otherwise. But remember at least, we have not been unprovoked. We are a rude and an ignorant, and it may be a violent and passionate, but we are not a cruel people. The land might be at peace and in law for us, that they allow us to enjoy the blessings of peaceful law, but we have been a persecuted people. A persecution, said the Bailie, maketh wise men mad. What must it do then to men like us, living as our fathers did 1,000 years since, and possessing scarce more lights than they did? Can we view their bloody edicts against us, their hanging, heading, hounding, and hunting us down, an ancient and honourable name, as deserving better treatment than that which the enemies give to enemies? Here I stand, have been in 20 frays, and April 1763, because they let off France too lightly. In the very next issue, Wilkes begins by declaring, all of us who are revolutionaries are fully convinced that men who are not made to be treated as if they were the property of any individual, who partakes of the same nature with themselves. That last phrase is really telling. Wilkes only recognises as human those who are like himself, and that specifically excludes Highlanders. He says that. And, although he doesn't say this, I assume the black slaves of North America and the West Indies. The classification of people as unlike yourself dehumanises them. And that is what Frank is objecting to when listening to Jarvie's description of the Highland economy. Helen MacGregor says of her husband that he never exchanges the tartan for the braid cloth, but he runs himself into the miserable intrigues of the lowlands and becomes again, after all he has suffered, their agent, their tool, their slave. Rob Roy may not be the biggest figure in the action of Rob Roy, but Rob Roy is the ideal figure of the novel. When he came to editing the novel for the Magnum, Scott did write up to the name. He knew, because people criticised him for it, that he had not written up to the name in the novel. But when he came to edit the Magnum in the late 20s, he did recognise that he had not done so. And he does write up to the name in the introduction. For the introduction at 135 pages is the longest he wrote, and it focuses entirely upon the man, Rob Roy. Scott does not base his account upon contemporary written documents, as David Stevenson does in his excellent study, The Hunt for Rob Roy, but largely upon stories he had heard. These are often not factual, as David Stevenson and Angus Stewart have shown, but are recollections that seem to fuse different incidents and to embroider others. Scott accounting for the wealth and variety of these stories, suggests that Rob Roy owed his fame in a great measure to his residing on the very verge of the Highlands and playing such pranks at the beginning of the 18th century as are usually ascribed to Robin Hood in the Middle Ages, and that within 40 miles of Glasgow, a great commercial city and the seat of a learned university. Lovely sentence. Neatly transforms the stories of a man's serial law-breaking into matters worthy of chuckling admiration. The effect of this long and engaging introduction is to transform the novel into a work about Rob Roy. And at this point, I hand back to Peter for the afterlife of Rob Roy.
Very briefly, I promise you, before concluding, it's worth taking a look at the afterlife of Rob Roy as a multimedia phenomenon, one amply illustrated in the current exhibition at Abbotsford. At one point we were talking about going there ourselves, so it became impractical. Has anybody else seen this exhibition based on Rob Roy? Oh, I can tell you a bit about it in that case. It relates chiefly to the dramatisation of the novel, and most especially to the long-standing success of Isaac Pocock's operatic drama Rob Roy MacGregor, or Auld Lang Syne, first performed at Covent Garden in March 1818, followed by a long run at the Theatre Royal Edinburgh in 1819. Overall, Rob Roy was the most dramatised of Scott's novels, with nearly 1,000 productions during the 19th century, most of them based on Pocock's script. Pocock's version tends to truncate the plot, focusing on events in the second half of the novel, and ends not at Osbaldeston Hall, but in Rob Roy's cave. Star actors normally played Rob Roy and Helen MacGregor, both arrayed in full Highland costume, as directed by the stage instructions. At the same time, Pocock gives full voice to the story's comic characters, notably Nicol Jarvie, who was most commonly played in Scott's time by the actor Charles Mackay, this supposedly giving rise to the expression "the real Mackay," as demanded by audiences when a substitute actor appeared. "We want the real Mackay" is one of several explanations of that phrase. There's an American one as well, which turns Mackay into McCoy. Another feature was the inclusion of a number of national songs by Burns, Scott and others. In Scotland especially, the play was popular for benefit or command performances, most famously on the occasion of George IV's visit in 1822, where it was performed as a unifying national opera, and for which Scott wrote an additional verse to the concluding royal anthem. As late as 1962, the play was performed at the Lyceum Theatre to mark a state visit by the King of Norway in company with the British royal family, though by this time one senses it was being trotted out rather as a lame kind of expectation. By then, too, film versions had overtaken stage productions. There were a number of silent movies, some now lost, these being followed by Walt Disney's Rob Roy, the Highland Rogue, 1953, in glorious, or rather hideous, Technicolor, shot on location in Aberfoyle and starring Richard Todd. As the second part of the title indicates, this involved a shift away from the original narrative towards the legendary Rob Roy. The absence of Scott in the publicity material, possibly reflecting a decline in his reputation in the modern era. A similar tendency is apparent in the 1995 blockbuster starring Liam Neeson as Rob Roy. How many people have seen that? A smattering. In which the Scott connection is almost entirely given away to Rob's feud with the Duke of Montrose, an entirely new villain being provided by Tim Roth's an illegitimate bow swordsman, and where the nearest equivalent to Jarvie is an unscrupulous land agent played by Brian Cox, whose costume is now at Abbotsford among the exhibits. A further offshoot might be claimed in the popular TV series Outlander. Can we have a show of hands for Outlander? But somebody admits it's in a shamefaced sort of way there. But we've watched it all up to the we haven't got the filming the most recent third series.
Embarrassed to admit to it.
Yeah, in which the Rob figure becomes the Highland laddie Jamie Fraser, and the visitor from outside an actual time traveller in the form of Claire, who zooms in to the early 1740s from 1945. This dissipation of the original novel might also be seen as reflected in the paucity of paperback editions today. Of Everyman, Penguin and World's Classics editions, all stemming from the 1990s and Magnum based, only the World's Classics one, edited by Ian Duncan, now appears to be in print. Considering that we are now fast approaching the bi-centenary of the original publication, it seems a shame that no publisher, especially Penguin, is apparently stepping up to the plate to provide an accessible first edition based and properly annotated version of this great novel. At which point we throw things open to the floor. David, would you like to receive?
Well,
both of us. Both of us. Here we are. Okay, with the mic there. What are you about to say something? Jump back.
I had something not very constructive to say, but I noted that Peacock's remark about, I think I wrote it down correctly. On the arrival of Rob Roy, the author lays aside his Plato. Is rather like the introduction to Kidnapped, where the schoolboy lays aside his Ovid on the appearance of Alan Breck.
Yes, in fact, I probably didn't read it adequately enough. It's the scholar. Peacock is describing various types in society. He's doing chuckling under his breath at the same time. And it was on the arrival of Rob Roy, the scholar lays loud his Plato.
That fits rather well with the schoolboy or whatever.
Yes.
but hope that the people editing the Edinburgh Stevenson have picked that up and making a note about it.
The general idea, the general idea is that people who wouldn't have gone near a novel in the past are doing so with Walter Scott, I think. That was a general idea that was around at that time. And partly explains the large impression I mentioned, because to print 13,000 copies within a space of a few months and sell them, it does mean that people are actually buying copies. So to buy a copy at 24 shillings, was it, David, or
Yes, I think so.
something, it's equivalent to about 150, 175 pounds nowadays. People who had those sort of resources were actually buying fiction, a lot of them for the first time, I think.
I wonder if you care to say something about Scott's immersion to detail, particularly in his geographical approach to Balquhidder and the like. I seem to remember that he used to ride a horse backwards and forwards from point A to point B to see how long it took,
Yes.
and then reproduce this sort of information as background.
David knows about this. He did. He went on trips beforehand to survey landscape, and it's more specific in this novel than any
Yes.
other.
He did not, in writing Rob Roy, he did not do that, but he had done it for The Lady of the Lake. Because he actually went to Balquhidder and worked out how long it would take to get to Stirling.
Yeah.
That was for James V's journey, followed up, of course, by the rest of them to get to Stirling and so on. So, but Scott never wasted things. So, having done it once, he wouldn't do it again. He would just incorporate it. but yes, he did go and physically revisit places in order to get that kind of precision. He's not always right, but he also, when dealing with places he hadn't visited,
for example, Provence of Quentin Durward, he uses James Skeen's illustrations of Quentin Durward, of Provence, as a means of prompting him for descriptions as to the kind of scenery that takes place, that could be seen.
He did go to a friend on the foot of the bottom of Loch Lomond, I think, with this novel in mind.
He did, yes,
Just
that's
as
right.
he was writing it. But I must say, reading it, having known Waverley before, it did seem me that the locations were more specific than in some other Scott novels. You know, we've got Aberfoyle, we've got the source of the Forth at one point. We've got various viewpoints, haven't we?
Yes, yes.
Which presumably are reasonably accurate.
Yes,
Yes.
yes. Well, you can locate them, yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Peter did mention the Rob Roy exhibition at Abbotsford. We went a couple of weeks ago to have a look at it and discovered that you have to pay to go into the house in order to see this exhibition. We had hoped that it would be sort of in the exhibition centre where the restaurant is and everything. But we decided to put our hands in our pockets, and we did pay to go down. And although it's a small exhibition, I thought it was extremely interesting and very well put together. Well worth doing if you're in that direction.
So is it in that little breakfast room?
Yes,
Yes,
that's
yes.
right.
I know
We're,
we have
we've been there for exhibitions before.
Yeah.
The breakfast room, that is.
How long does it run for?
I'm not sure.
I don't know. You'd have to
In
look
other
it
words,
up.
how much time is left?
Yes, right.
You'd have to look it up on the internet. to
I
see
think
what,
I can look it up afterwards
Yeah.
while we're having our sandwiches.
Yes.
We were talking, instead of this colloquium, we were thinking of going to Abbotsford, where we were going to be shown round by someone, Kirsten Archer-Thompson, who is a member of our council now. But then we heard that there was a steam train excursion that same day, and we knew that the people at Abbotsford would be flat out sort of looking after that. And I just sniffed chaos at that point, I'm afraid, and Louise tended to agree. But there may be some possibility in the coming programme to make a visit if we can find enough people to Abbotsford. And it might be worth finding out how long this exhibition is running in view of that possibility as well.
We'll certainly look it up. Yeah.
David.
I seem to remember reading your edition that Scott wasn't really very happy to have the novel named Rob Roy.
Yes.
But what do we know what he had in mind otherwise?
No, we don't know what in mind. But his point is that he usually gives names to novels that tell the reader nothing. You know, Waverley, Guy Mannering, The Antiquary, Old Mortality, who's how it was published, although we've christened it The Tale of Old Mortality. You know, you don't know from these names what's inside. So he was objecting to Rob Roy because he would have to write about Rob Roy instead of being able to develop the character as he wanted. But he also wanted the contract, so he agreed to what Constable was proposing, and then paid no attention, I think, or paid little attention to writing up to the name, because Rob Roy appears in the first volume very briefly in the Yorkshire Inn, and again in Justice Inglewood's, having got Frank off the hook of being accused of highway robbery, and then again in Glasgow when he takes him into the prison. But we don't really get an extended look of Rob Roy until much later on when they're in the inn together, and Rob Roy gets a chance to. So he's done what he wanted with him. Yeah.
This was reflected in the early illustrations of this novel, and this is the second most illustrated of Scott's novels as well, even though it's competing with some 4 volumes. novels in that respect. But the most common scenes in the early decades were Di, Vernon and Frank in the library, with or without Sir Frederick in the shadows, and the other was the brawl in the Clachan at Aberfoyle. That was immensely popular for its comic possibilities as much as anything.
Well, it is wonderfully comic, isn't
Yes,
it?
yes.
Fighting with a red hot poker and setting the man's plate alight and having to supply a new plate in order to pacify him.
I can't remember the name of the courier who was carrying all the money, but he was incredibly incompetent. Is there any reason why, I presume that is a fictional character?
Well, I'm sure that Morris in himself is fictional, but Rob Roy was accused of stopping a government agent, stealing the cash that he was carrying to pay the British Army, and dispatches from the government with carrying orders to generals operating in Scotland. So the incident happened, and Rob Roy was implicated, but I'm sure that Scott had, there was no descriptions at all as to what sort of an agent it was and whether he was as amusing as that one is. Couldn't possibly have been as idiotic as that one. But.
On our recent visit to Abbotsford, I noticed in the grounds there is a sculpture of Morris pleading not to be turfed off into the lake underneath, which presumably was made in Scott's own time. Yes. We are just gone past 1 o'clock. Any other quick question that anybody's holding back?
Or challenges.
Or challenges.
It's interesting the way in this book, as in several others, Scott seems to be fascinated by the Jacobite cause and by Catholicism, but sort of is fascinating, then has to say something, but of course, it's a bad thing, and he sort of becomes intrigued by it and then knocks it down in a sense.
In his day, saying nice things about the Catholic Church would have been entirely restricted to people who were themselves Catholic. I mean, the Protestantism was so rampant that Catholicism was regarded as a superstition. I'm quoting. I'm not. Those are not my words. That's the way it was. So, in depicting a Diana Vernon like this, it's actually quite a courageous step in saying things about Catholicism as a religion which should be honoured. It's difficult, of course, to think oneself back into exactly how the original readers would have responded, but...
He seems to push that as far as you could
Yes,
in the
yes.
sense of...
No.
Perhaps Scott was also, he was an Episcopalian rather than a Presbyterian, and that might be sort of halfway.
Well, this gets quite complicated.
Yes, it does. But
Scott himself was brought up, of course. He was a member of we went to church in Greyfriars with his father from George Square. He was still. He became an elder of Duddingston Kirk in 1800. He married his wife 1797, and she was an Anglican, but of course she was a French émigré, so she presumably had been brought up Catholic. So the pews in, first of all, in the Episcopalian Church in York Place, is it? What's it called? I've forgotten its name. Yeah, that's right, yes. St. Paul's and St. George's, yes. They originally were members there, and the name of the pews in his name, but it's suggested that in fact only Lady Scott went and Scott didn't usually attend. Similarly, when they moved to St John's, after St John's was built, Scott had a pew, but again it was Lady Scott who was the person who normally went. So Scott himself, I don't think it's right to call him an Episcopalian. I think he was non-religious by this time. It wasn't that he. Would you agree, Peter?
I think he inherited a lot of the secular beliefs of the Scottish Enlightenment. I do, and then he had that back history of Presbyterianism.
Yes.
It would be difficult for him to become an all-out Episcopalian, even less Catholic in my view.
Yes.
But he had that element of sympathy.
Yes. And of course, he
yes.
married a French wife.
Yes.
Which is, it has to be significant, doesn't it? Yeah. Although nobody has ever made very much of, shall we say, the ideological implications of marrying a French wife in the 1790s.
Yeah, and he married a French wife in opposition to his own father.
Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But the monastery is, so sorry.
And I was going to ask the same question.
I was going to ask, if I may, is there a particular Catholic family that one can identify as the model for the Vernons? Is it the Vernons?
I could not find any for the Vernons, no.
I'll give you a suggestion.
Right.
I was only going to say that the monastery, when I read that, I was so impressed by how even-handed Scott was for the reformers and the existing church.
But then I think he did get quite a lot of flack for that too. I mean, the monastery wasn't initially popular.
No. The interesting one is the Tale of Old Mortality, isn't it, Peter? Mm-hmm. Because the first chapter of the Tale of Old Mortality, Peter Patterson, the nominal author, is the village schoolmaster, and he's a poet. So he is a man of some education and some sensitivity. I think that's. He goes and he talks to the lairds. He also talks to Old Mortality and others. So he is trying to get information from both sides of a civil conflict and based upon religion. And the reviews in the beginning of 1817 of the Tale of Old Mortality were very hostile. On the grounds that he had totally misinterpreted the Covenanters. What was the man's name who wrote in the Edinburgh Christian Instructor?
Another senior moment, yes. We used to know this so well, didn't we?
Yes.
He wrote a great big long one. It was
yes.
published as a book, the review.
Yes, and really denunciation yeah. of Scott's treatment of the Covenanters. And then there were other people who thought that like James Hogg, who thought he was entirely on the other side. I must say, I don't feel that reading it. It seems to me it is on. Yeah.
Some people don't want a balanced account; they only want their account.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Also, I think what you regard as balance depends to a certain extent
of
on where you stand and
yes.
in what sort of world
yes.
you live.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
As is happening in America at the moment,
yes.
with statues.
Yes.
Yeah.
When you read David Hume on 1679, and then you read the Tale of Old Mortality, you think, gosh, this is very sympathetic to Covenanters. I mean, the Tale of Old Mortality. And you know, so there is a conscious opposition to the standard narrative about the conflict but of course popular opinion thought differently.
I think the sandwiches are out there, and we'd better go.
Should I just round it off?
If you would, are you going to mention our next talk? Because if you're not, I will.
I wasn't going to.
Our next talk is by a lady novelist who's written a novel about Scott's early romantic life with regard to his two loves, Williamina Belchers and Charlotte Carpentier, his wife. And a good half of it is about Scott meeting Charlotte, his wife, in Gillsland, which was a spa resort at that time. Gillian and I are going to do another field trip. She thinks it's just a holiday, and we're going to go to Gillsland to see for ourselves before this talk. But I think one of the mysteries about Scott is the relationship with Charlotte. What did attract him so much? Why did it last so well? And there she
That's
is.
what attracted
Oh,
me.
I see. You carry it everywhere, do you?
No, I thought that somebody would say that who's Di based on, and I think Diana Vernon relates to his wife.
Interesting.
People say Williamina, but Williamina was a timid little mouse. When he met Charlotte, she was on horseback. And just as Frank meets Di, he's on foot and she's on horseback.
Beautifully dressed then, she was on horseback.
Yes, yes. And that's a sexy woman, isn't it?
A3 material.
Yes. Well, no, she's an attractive woman, that.
Yes.
Right.
Well, just a brief thank you to both David and Peter for, well, I don't think we're surprised, what was a fantastic, explanation, putting into context of this particular novel of Walter Scott. And I think, there was so much that obviously I can't mention even half of it, but I think there are 3 points that I'd like to make which certainly appealed to me particularly. One is this background in the commercial world, which for a novel I think is unusual, and the idea that this novel particularly sold so extremely well, I think says an awful lot about how Scott was able to bring a field that is really quite remote for a lot of people's experience, certainly in those days, i.e. the commercial world, so close and so alive, make it so alive that people actually wanted to read about it. I find that quite remarkable. And also then the connection between the commercial circumstances, his own commercial circumstances, the commercial circumstances he describes in the novel, and then the lead onto the political reaction and the underlying cause of the coming rebellion, which might well have been commercial. So I thought that was extremely interesting and probably something that we all want to pursue further and perhaps reread Rob Roy thinking of that. The second point, which I found very attractive, and I've always found it attractive, is this retrospective narrative. I think it's absolutely fascinating. It's one of the things I enjoy about Walter Scott anyway, but here we have more than the usual. We have 1715 when the story is set. We have 1763 when Frank writes the story. We have 1817 when Scott writes the story of Frank writing the story. And then we have us in 2017 looking at Scott 200 years ago, looking at both 1763, but in particular also at 1715, of course, which is 100 years further along, and his view of that, which must have been different from our view now 200 years on. And I think that is, well, I'm a historian, so that is something I find extraordinarily interesting, because again, we are in our period, we see things from a certain point of view. He was 200 years earlier. In his world, he would have seen it different, and 100 years before, for him, was sort of 3 generations. One can reach 3 generations through family history and so on. we can't reach 300 years back. So he has definitely got something to add. And finally, there was this question about, or this comment on the precision of his descriptions. And I think that is just something that I would like to mention too, because he was obviously very, very good at looking and describing, and not just, and thinking about what he sees and what he describes. And certainly for me personally, that is what makes him so attractive. I can be there with him, following his description and in that world, because he describes it so well, and particularly so credibly, particularly when it's journeys and people moving, and you think, yes, I can see that in that period they would have done it like that, and I'm learning something. So thank you for bringing all that to life for us. And finally, I would like to just say I have a copy here of this Pocock play. It's a facsimile edition from the British Library, and if anybody would like to just have a look. Unfortunately, the actor for Nicol Jarvie is somebody else, it's a Mr. Liston, so I have to disappoint you there. But yes, thank you, David, for coming and doing that for us, and thank you, Peter, the same, and obviously, however familiar you are with what you've been talking about, it still needs preparing and getting it down into whatever, 15, 20 minutes, which is never easy. So thank you very, very much indeed.